September 11th, 1297. The morning mist clings to the river Forth like a death shroud. On the south bank, the most powerful army in Europe prepares to cross a narrow wooden bridge. Knights in gleaming armor. Thousands of infantry. The pride of King Edward I war machine. They expect an easy victory over a rabble of Scottish peasants. But waiting on the north bank, hidden in the shadows of Abbey Craig, two men are about to turn that bridge into a slaughterhouse. William Wallace and Andrew Moray have set a trap so brilliantly simple, so devastatingly effective, that by day's end, the River Forth will run red with English blood. This is the story of how a guerrilla fighter and a young nobleman destroyed one of the finest armies medieval Europe had ever assembled. This is the Battle of Stirling Bridge. To understand how Scotland reached this desperate moment, we must go back 1 year earlier to 1296, when the Kingdom of Scotland ceased to exist. King Edward I of England, a man who would be remembered by history as the Hammer of the Scots, had done what no English king before him had accomplished. He had conquered Scotland completely, utterly, and with terrifying efficiency. The great Scottish defeat at Dunbar that spring had been catastrophic. Scotland's nobility, the backbone of any medieval kingdom, had been crushed in a single afternoon of battle. Castles surrendered without a fight. Towns threw open their gates. The Scottish crown, once proud and independent, lay shattered at Edward's feet. Edward moved with the precision of a master strategist. He understood that conquering a kingdom required more than just military victory. It required breaking the spirit of the people, destroying the symbols of their independence, erasing their very identity as a nation. And so he seized the stone of destiny from Scone Abbey, the sacred coronation stone upon which every Scottish king for centuries had been crowned. He loaded this ancient symbol onto a wagon and transported it to Westminster Abbey in London, where it would remain for 700 years. The message was clear. Scotland's kings were gone. Scotland's independence was finished. Scotland itself was now nothing more than a northern province, but Edward didn't stop there. He created what became known as the Ragman Rolls, a document that would live in infamy in Scottish memory. Nearly every Scottish noble, knight, and landholder of any importance was forced to swear allegiance to Edward as their overlord. One by one, they came forward, some defiant, some broken, most simply pragmatic, recognizing that resistance meant death or imprisonment. They signed their names or made their marks on the endless scrolls of parchment. With each signature, Scotland's independence died a little more. The ruling elite, bound by oath and honor to the English crown, became Edward's collaborators in the occupation of their own country. Edward believed his conquest was complete. On parchment, in the records kept by his scribes, Scotland was pacified, subdued, ruled. But conquest written in ink and conquest written in the hearts of the people are two very different things. And Edward was about to learn that the hardest way possible. The English occupation that followed was brutal in its efficiency and suffocating in its totality. Edward's officials descended upon Scotland like locusts, extracting every penny of wealth they could squeeze from the land. The taxation was crushing, designed not to govern Scotland, but to drain it, to finance Edward's endless wars in France and Wales. Every bushel of grain, every head of cattle, every silver penny that could be found was requisitioned, recorded, and shipped south to England. Scotland, once a prosperous kingdom, began to starve under the weight of English greed. English soldiers garrisoned every town of importance, every strategic castle, every crossroads that mattered. These weren't peacekeepers. They were an occupying army, and they treated the Scottish population with the contempt that conquerors often show the conquered. Scottish merchants were forced to pay heavy tolls at every turn. Farmers watched helplessly as their harvests were seized to feed English garrisons. Priests were viewed with suspicion, their churches watched, their sermons monitored for any hint of sedition. and anyone caught speaking against English rule faced swift and brutal punishment. But no figure became more hated, more despised, more symbolic of English oppression than Hugh Cressingham, Edward's treasurer in Scotland. Cressingham was everything the Scots learned to loathe about their occupiers. He was cruel, arrogant, and astonishingly greedy even by the standards of medieval tax collectors. Stories spread throughout Scotland of his excesses. How he had grown rich bleeding the country white. How he dined on fine imported wines while Scottish children starved. How he laughed at the suffering of the people he was supposed to govern. Chronicles describe him as corpulent, corrupt, and so universally hated that his name became a curse word. Mothers frightened children into obedience by threatening that Cressingham would come for them. His very presence in Scotland was an insult, a daily reminder of English domination. For the common people of Scotland, life under occupation became increasingly unbearable. A farmer who had once kept enough grain to feed his family through winter now watched English soldiers cart away 3/4 of his harvest. A merchant who had traded freely across Scotland now paid so many tolls and taxes that his profit disappeared. A craftsman found his tools requisitioned, his workshop taken over to billet English soldiers. And everywhere, the subtle and not-so-subtle humiliations of occupation. Scottish customs dismissed as barbaric. The Scots language mocked as crude. The very identity of being Scottish treated as something to be ashamed of, to be stamped out, to be replaced with English ways. Scotland was occupied, but Scotland was never tamed. And in the hearts of the people, in the dark forests and lonely glens, in the whispered conversations in taverns and churches, rebellion began to stir. At first, it was nothing organized, nothing that looked like an army or even a movement. Just scattered acts of defiance. An English tax collector found dead on a lonely road, his strongbox missing, his throat cut. A garrison harassed at night by shadowy figures who melted into the darkness before soldiers could respond. A castle under English control suddenly finding itself under siege by local insurgents who appeared from nowhere and vanished just as quickly. These weren't battles. They were symptoms. Scotland was a wound that refused to heal, and infection was spreading. From this chaos of scattered resistance, two figures began to emerge. Two men who would transform random acts of defiance into coordinated rebellion. Two leaders who would give Scotland hope when hope seemed impossible. In the north, Andrew Moray of Bothwell raised his banner. Moray was everything William Wallace was not. He was a nobleman, educated, trained in warfare, connected to Scotland's ruling elite. He had fought at Dunbar and been captured by the English. But unlike so many Scottish nobles who had bent the knee and accepted English rule, Moray escaped from captivity and returned to his homeland in the Highlands with fire in his heart and vengeance on his mind. He began rallying the clans, gathering freeholders, besieging English-held castles across the north of Scotland. Moray's campaign was methodical, strategic, brilliant. He understood logistics, he knew how to organize supply lines, he could coordinate sieges across multiple locations simultaneously. Castle by castle, garrison by garrison, he was liberating northern Scotland. In the south, a very different kind of leader was rising. William Wallace entered English records in May 1297 not as a noble warrior, but as a criminal, a murderer, an outlaw. He had killed William Heselrigg, the English sheriff of Lanark, in an open act of defiance that sent shockwaves through the occupation authorities. The details are murky, lost to history and embellished by legend. Some chronicles suggest Heselrigg had killed Wallace's wife or lover. Others claim it was revenge for English atrocities against Wallace's family. What we know for certain is that Wallace led a band of armed men into Lanark, found the sheriff, and cut him down. Then he and his followers set the town ablaze and disappeared into the forests. To the English, Wallace was everything they feared most about Scotland, violent, unpredictable, impossible to control. He was a brigand, a criminal, a terrorist who struck without warning and vanished before retaliation could come. But to the Scots, Wallace was something very... He was a man who had dared to strike back. He was proof that the English could bleed. He was hope incarnate. Wallace's rebellion was nothing like Moray's organized campaign in the north. Wallace fought a guerrilla war, a war of shadows and sudden violence. His band was small, maybe a few dozen men at first, recruited from the desperate and the dispossessed. Outlaws who had nothing left to lose. Peasants whose families had been destroyed by English occupation. Younger sons of minor nobles who had no inheritance and no future under English rule. Anyone with a reason to hate the English and the courage to fight back found their way to Wallace. They knew every forest trail, every hidden glen, every cave and abandoned mill where a small band could hide from pursuing soldiers. They struck where the enemy was weakest and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. English patrols ambushed in narrow valleys where heavy cavalry couldn't maneuver. Supply trains burned on lonely roads, their guards killed, their goods scattered. Garrisons attacked at night with fire and fury, then nothing but smoke and bodies by morning. Wallace understood something that would make him one of history's great guerrilla fighters. He couldn't defeat the English in open battle, not yet, so he wouldn't try. Instead, he would bleed them, exhaust them, terrify them, make them understand that every day of occupation would cost English blood. And with each small victory, Wallace's fame grew. Stories spread faster than he could travel. Tales of his height. Chronicles claim he stood nearly 7 feet tall, a giant among men. Stories of his strength, that he could cleave a man in two with a single sword stroke. Legends of his cunning, that he could vanish like smoke and appear behind enemy lines, as if by magic. Some of these stories were surely exaggerations, the kind of myths that grow around any folk hero. But they serve a purpose. They gave the Scottish people something they desperately needed, a hero who could stand against the English and win. By the summer of 1297, Scotland was ablaze with rebellion. In the north, Moray was methodically dismantling English control, castle by castle. In the south and central regions, Wallace's raids were becoming bolder, his forces larger, his victories more significant. The two men had never met, but they were fighting the same war, and soon their paths would converge in a way that would change history. The Scottish Church, which had initially been cautious about supporting rebellion. After all, many bishops and priests feared Edward's terrible wrath, began a shift. Quietly at first, then more openly, clergy started blessing the rebellion. Priests offered sanctuary to wanted men. Monasteries became hiding places for weapons and supplies. Parish tithes, supposedly collected for the church, mysteriously found their way into rebel hands to buy food and equipment. The cause of Scottish freedom was gaining not just popular support, but religious legitimacy. This was no longer just a rebellion of desperate outlaws. It was becoming a holy cause, a fight blessed by God himself. Sometime in August or early September 1297, the inevitable happened. Wallace and Moray met, joined forces, and combined their armies. Together they commanded perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 men. It wasn't a professional army by any stretch. Most wore no armor beyond leather jerkins or padded gambesons. Their primary weapon was the spear, cheap to make and effective in the right hands. They had few horses, fewer trained knights, almost no siege equipment. What they had was determination, knowledge of the land, and two brilliant commanders who understood that they couldn't fight the English the way the English wanted to fight. They would have to be smarter, faster, more cunning. And so they chose their battlefield carefully. Stirling, the key to Scotland. The gateway between the lowlands and the highlands. The place where any English army marching north had to cross. And more specifically, they chose the narrow wooden bridge across the river. That bridge, barely wide enough for two mounted men to ride side by side, would become their weapon. Meanwhile, Edward I's lieutenants were gathering a massive army to crush this rebellion once and for all. John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, was an experienced commander, a veteran of Edward's wars. But he was also aging and in poor health. His subordinate, the despised Hugh Cressingham, was pushing aggressively for immediate action. Cressingham saw the rebellion as an insult to his authority, a nuisance that needed to be swatted down quickly and brutally. Together, they assembled a force of perhaps 8,000 to 12,000 men. The numbers are disputed by historians, but what's certain is that the English army was formidable. Hundreds of heavy cavalry, the elite of medieval warfare, mounted knights in gleaming plate and chain-mail armor. Thousands of infantry levies drawn from England's shires, armed with spears, axes, and swords. Companies of Welsh longbowmen, whose deadly accuracy had won battles across Europe. This was an army that had conquered Wales, that had smashed the Scots at Dunbar, that represented the military might of the most powerful kingdom in Britain. They marched north in September with absolute confidence. The rebellion would be crushed. Wallace and Moray would be captured, tried, and executed. Scotland would learn its lesson. And Hugh Cressingham would return to his comfortable position, extracting wealth from a pacified. The English expected the Scots to melt away before them, as rebels so often did when faced with overwhelming force. Instead, they found Wallace and Moray waiting. And the trap was set. The town of Stirling, perched on its rocky crag, crowned by its imposing castle, had been known for centuries as the key to Scotland. Geography made it so. The River Forth, wide and marshy at this point, created a natural boundary between the fertile lowlands to the south and the rugged highlands to the north. Whoever controlled Stirling controlled the crossing. Whoever controlled the crossing controlled Scotland. The castle itself was in English hands, but the bridge, the vital wooden bridge that connected the two banks of the Forth, was about to become the most important piece of ground. To the English commanders looking at the bridge, it must have seemed like a minor obstacle. Yes, it was narrow, but their army could cross. It would take time, but once across, their superior numbers and cavalry would crush the Scottish rabble. They failed to understand what Wallace and Moray had realized. That bridge wasn't an obstacle. It was a bottleneck. It was a funnel that would channel English strength into a killing zone. It was the trap that would destroy them. The English army that arrived at Stirling in early September was everything a medieval force should be. The heavy cavalry, consisting of hundreds of mounted knights, represented the cream of English military power. These were professional warriors, men who had trained for war since childhood. They rode massive destrier war horses, bred for size and aggression. They wore full-plate armor over chainmail, carried lances and swords, and fought in coordinated charges that could shatter infantry formations like a hammer striking glass. In open battle, on good ground, English heavy cavalry was nearly unstoppable. They had proven it at Falkirk, at Crecy, at countless battles across Europe. Supporting the cavalry were thousands of infantry. These weren't professional soldiers, but shire levies, ordinary men called to war by their lords. Farmers and craftsmen who knew how to use a spear or axe, who had basic training but little experience. They were adequate soldiers in a pitched battle, useful for holding ground or pursuing broken enemies, but they weren't the elite. That role belonged to the Welsh archers, skilled longbowmen whose weapon could punch through armor at 200 yards. In the right circumstances, on open ground with clear lines of sight, Welsh archers could dominate a battlefield, filling the air with such a volume of arrows that chronicles described it as a storm of steel. But the ground near Stirling was far from ideal for the English way of war. The north bank of the Forth was marshy, soft, treacherous for heavy cavalry. The bridge itself was a nightmare of logistics, barely wide enough for two riders, groaning under the weight of armored men and horses. And beyond the bridge, The land was hemmed in, compressed between the river and rising ground. There was no room for the sweeping cavalry charges that English commanders relied on. There was no open field where archers could deploy in their devastating lines. There was just a narrow strip of marshy ground, and on the slopes above it, hidden from view, Wallace and Moray waited with their spearmen. The Scottish army was everything the English army was not. Where the English had heavy cavalry, the Scots had spearmen. Where the English had plate armor, the Scots had leather jerkins and hope. Where the English had professional soldiers, the Scots had farmers and outlaws who had learned to fight out of necessity. But what the Scots lacked in equipment and training, they made up for in three crucial advantages. They knew the ground, they were fighting for their homes and freedom, and they had commanders who understood that you don't fight the enemy's battle, you make the enemy fight yours. Wallace and Moray had organized their men into schiltrons, formations that would become famous in Scottish military history. A schiltron was a tight circle or rectangle of spearmen, with long spears bristling outward like a hedgehog's quills. Against cavalry, properly maintained schiltrons were devastatingly effective. Horses, no matter how well trained, will not willingly charge into a wall of spear points. Knights could ride around schiltrons, could attack them with arrows or crossbow bolts, could try to break them through sheer persistence. But a direct cavalry charge against a well-formed schiltron was suicide. On open ground, schiltrons had their weaknesses. They were immobile, slow to maneuver, vulnerable if they lost cohesion. But on the marshy banks of the Forth, hemmed in by the narrow bridge, those weaknesses didn't matter. The ground itself would prevent the English from using their cavalry effectively. The bridge would prevent them from bringing their full force to bear at once. And the schiltrons would be the anvil against which English knights would be hammered into blood and broken steel. The mood in the two armies could not have been more different. In the English camp, confidence bordered on arrogance. Knights polished their armor until it gleamed in the September sun. They boasted about how quickly they would scatter the Scots, how many rebels they would personally kill. Some looked forward not just to battle, but to the plunder that would follow. Scotland was a rich land, and a victorious army traditionally got to loot. Many English soldiers were already imagining the gold and silver they would take home. Some openly scoffed at the idea that Wallace and Moray would dare face them in battle. Surely, they thought, the rebels would see the English banners and flee into the hills like the cowards they were. Among the Scots, the mood was grimly determined. These men knew they were outmatched. They could see the English army across the river, could count the banners, and estimate the numbers. They knew many of them would die today, but they also knew why they were fighting. They had seen their homes burned, their families taxed into starvation, their country occupied by foreign soldiers who treated them with contempt. They had nothing left to lose and everything to fight. Many had lost brothers, fathers, sons to English cruelty. For them, this wasn't just a battle. It was vengeance. It was justice. It was the moment when Scotland would stop running and start fighting back. Wallace moved among his men that morning, his presence like a talisman. He was not a noble, not educated in Latin or trained in courtly manners. But he understood soldiers. He spoke their language. He had marched with them, eaten with them, bled with them. When Wallace told them they could win, they believed him. When he reminded them what they were fighting for, they gripped their spears tighter. Moray, more reserved but no less determined, checked positions, made sure the schiltrons were properly formed, ensured that every man knew his place and his role in the coming battle. And then they waited. Waiting was the hardest part. Waiting while the English gathered on the south bank. Waiting while the enemy began to cross. Waiting while every instinct screamed to attack, to charge, to fight. But Wallace and Moray had made their plan, and everything depended on timing. Attack too soon, and the English would retreat and find another crossing. Attack too late, and too many English would be across, overwhelming the Scots with sheer numbers. They needed to wait for that perfect moment when enough English had crossed to be worth destroying, but not so many that the Scots would be overwhelmed. They needed patience, discipline, and nerves of steel. The morning of September 11th, 1297, dawned cool and misty, the kind of Scottish morning where the world seems wrapped in gray silence. The River Forth lay like a sheet of hammered pewter beneath the fog, its waters sluggish and dark. From the south bank, the English army stirred to life. The sound of an army waking is distinctive. The clank of armor, the whinny of horses, the barked orders of sergeants getting men into formation, the scrape of whetstones on sword blades, the creak of leather, the murmur of thousands of voices. Banners began to unfurl in the dim morning light. The three lions of England, the various standards of noble houses, the cross of St. George. It was a display meant to inspire confidence in friends and fear in enemies. On the north bank, hidden behind the rising ground of Abbey Craig, the Scots waited in absolute silence. Wallace had given strict orders: no talking, no movement, nothing that might alert the English to their position. Spears were planted firmly in the earth, ready to be seized at a moment's notice. Dew glistened on makeshift armor and on the nervous faces of men waiting for battle. They could hear everything: the neigh of English horses carried across the water, the roll of drums, the distant commands. But they could not be seen, and they did not move. Their commanders had given one crystal-clear order: wait until the trap is set. Wait until the signal. Then attack with everything you have. In the English camp, disagreement flared into argument. Some of Surrey's more cautious advisers were troubled by the tactical situation. They pointed out the obvious problem: the bridge was too narrow, the ground beyond too restricted. They suggested finding the ford that lay a few miles upriver. Yes, it would mean a longer march, a delay of hours perhaps, but the army could cross in force, could deploy properly, could bring its full strength to bear against the Scots. Surrey himself, weary and feeling his age, seemed inclined toward this more cautious approach. But Hugh Cressingham would have none of it. The treasurer was livid at the suggestion of delay. He accused the cautious advisers of cowardice, of seeing ghosts where there were only ragged peasants. He insisted, with all the arrogance of a man who had never faced real combat, that the Scots were nothing more than a rabble, unworthy of serious military concern. Why waste time marching upriver? Why show fear of rebels? The bridge lay before them, clear and open. They should cross immediately, crush the Scots, and be done with it. To Cressingham, who saw war as an administrative problem to be solved, victory was already assured. The rebellion would be ended by lunchtime, and he could return to his comfortable life of extracting wealth from a pacified Scotland. His words, delivered with the absolute certainty of the foolish, prevailed over the concerns of more experienced soldiers. Surrey, tired and unwilling to fight his own subordinate, agreed. The English would cross at Stirling Bridge. Orders went out. The vanguard would cross first, secure the north bank, then the main body of the army would follow. It seemed straightforward enough. Thousands of men and horses crossing a narrow bridge would take time. Yes, but there was no hurry. The Scots weren't going anywhere. As the sun lifted higher, burning off the morning mist, the English vanguard began its crossing. The bridge groaned under the weight immediately. Medieval bridges were not the sturdy stone constructions we imagine. This was wood, old wood, weathered by Scottish rains and winters. It creaked and swayed as the first mounted knights rode across. Because the bridge was so narrow, barely wide enough for two horses side by side, what should have been the thunder of a cavalry advance became instead a slow, halting procession. One pair of knights at a time. Then another. Then another. Behind them came infantry, marching in columns just 2 men wide. Then more cavalry. Then archers. The crossing was agonizingly slow. On the far bank, the land narrowed into a bottleneck. To the left, the River Forth curved around, marshy and impassable. To the right, more marsh and rising ground. There was maybe 200 yards of relatively firm ground between the river and the slopes, and this space quickly filled with English soldiers as they completed their crossing. They formed up as best they could, try to maintain unit cohesion in the confined space, waiting for more of their comrades to cross so they could advance in proper formation. For hours this continued. The sun rose higher. The morning stretched toward midday. And still the English crossed, a slow trickle of military might flowing across the groaning bridge. On the slopes above, Wallace and Moray watched every movement. They counted banners, estimated numbers, calculated. The temptation to attack must have been almost unbearable. With each passing minute, more English soldiers crossed. More strength accumulated on the north bank. The Scottish advantage was draining away with every knight that crossed. Some of the Scots must have wondered if their commanders had lost their nerve, if the moment to strike had already passed. But Wallace and Moray knew exactly what they were doing. They were waiting for that precise moment when enough English had crossed to make their destruction worthwhile, but not so many that the Scots would be overwhelmed. They were waiting for the English to commit fully, to have so many troops on the north bank that retreat would be impossible. They were waiting for greed and confidence to lure the enemy into the perfect killing zone. Finally, when perhaps 2,000 English troops had crossed, including a substantial portion of the heavy cavalry and a significant number of infantry, Wallace decided the moment had come. The signal was given. War horns blared across the slopes, their harsh notes carrying across the marshy ground like the voice of doom itself. And with a roar that must have frozen English blood, the Scots surged from their hiding places. They came down from Abbey Craig like an avalanche of fury. Schiltrons of spearmen, tightly packed, spears leveled forward, moving with surprising speed despite their tight formation. Wallace was there, towering above his men, his voice roaring encouragement. Moray led another Schiltron, his noble training evident in the precision of his formation. The air filled with the sound of thousands of men shouting their defiance, their rage, their hunger for English blood. It filled with war cries in Scots Gaelic and English, with the thud of boots on marshy ground, with the clash of spear shafts against shields. The trap had been sprung, and the English suddenly realized they had walked into a slaughterhouse of their own making. The English knights, caught on the narrow strip of ground between river and rising land, found themselves in a tactical night. There was no room to form up properly for a charge. No space to build the momentum that made cavalry charges devastating. They were compressed, crowded together, hemmed in by their own comrades, with the bridge as their only escape route, and that bridge packed with troops still trying to cross. Some knights tried to charge anyway, spurring their horses forward toward the onrushing Scots. But their horses, powerful as they were, couldn't build speed in the soft, marshy ground. And when they reached the Schiltrons, they confronted a wall of spear points bristling like steel thorns. Horses reared, screaming, as spears drove into their chests and bellies. Knights were thrown from their saddles or dragged down by Scottish hands that grabbed at reins, at arms, at anything they could reach. The Schiltrons pressed forward relentlessly. Scottish spears drove into the gaps in armor, into horse flesh, into the packed mass of English troops. The English infantry tried to form defensive lines, but there was no room, no space to maneuver. They were crushed against their own cavalry, and the Scots showed no mercy. This was not a chivalrous battle fought according to the rules of medieval warfare. This was slaughter. This was payback for Dunbar, for the occupation, for Hugh Cressingham's cruelty, for every humiliation Scotland had endured. The Scots fought with a fury that terrified their enemies. On the bridge itself, absolute chaos erupted. Men still crossing saw the disaster unfolding on the north bank. They saw their comrades being cut down, saw horses toppling into the river, saw the Scottish spears rising and falling in a rhythm of death. Some tried to turn back, creating a collision with those still trying to cross. Horses reared and fell, crushing men beneath them. The wooden planks, slick with blood and mud, became treacherous. Men slipped and fell between the planks into the water below. The bridge began to buckle under the weight and the chaos, timbers groaning, planks cracking. It was a bottleneck of death, a place where armor became a death sentence. Men who fell into the Forth in full armor sank like stones, drowning in water that might have been only waist-deep to an unarmored man. Among the trapped English on the north bank was Hugh Cressingham himself. The hated treasurer, the man who had pushed so hard for this crossing, who had mocked the Scots as a rabble unworthy of concern, now found himself in the middle of the slaughter he had dismissed as impossible. Accounts vary on exactly how he died. Some say he tried to fight his way back to the bridge, others that he attempted to rally his men. But die he did, cut down by Scottish spears, his corpulent body adding to the pile of English dead. Later, chronicles would record that the Scots flayed the skin from his corpse and made it into souvenirs, belts, purses, strips of leather. Whether this actually happened or was propaganda, it spoke to the depth of Scottish hatred for the man who had symbolized their oppression. By midday, the carnage was complete on the north bank. The English vanguard had been annihilated. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, lay dead in the marshy ground. Their magnificent armor was covered in mud and blood. Their banners trampled into the earth. Their weapons scattered among the bodies. The survivors who had tried to flee back across the bridge found it jammed, found it collapsing, found it impossible to cross. Many threw themselves into the Forth, hoping to swim to safety, only to be dragged under by the weight of their armor. The water itself ran red, choked with bodies, with broken weapons, with the detritus of destroyed dreams. On the south bank, thousands of English soldiers watched in horror as their vanguard was destroyed before their eyes. At first, disbelief. Surely the knights would rally, would form up, would crush these Scottish peasants. But as the minutes turned to hours, as the screams carried across the water, as the English banners fell one by one, disbelief turned to horror. The Scottish rebels weren't just fighting. They were winning. They were destroying the finest cavalry England could field. The Earl of Surrey, watching from his command position, faced the most terrible decision of his military career. He could order the rest of his army to cross, to commit everything in an attempt to rescue the trapped vanguard. But the bridge was already collapsing, already clogged with the dead and dying. Sending more men across would be sending them to their deaths. Or he could retreat, could abandon his trapped soldiers, could save the rest of the army. It was the choice between catastrophe and humiliation. Surrey, his age and illness weighing on him, his confidence shattered, chose to retreat. Orders went out. Fall back, abandon the field, save what could be saved. The great English army, which had marched north with such confidence just days before, began a panicked withdrawal. Knights abandoned their gear in their haste to flee. Infantry threw away weapons and ran. The pride of English arms was fleeing before an army of Scottish commoners, and the shame of it would echo through history. The bridge itself, groaning under damage and neglect, finally gave way. Entire sections collapsed into the Forth with a crash that could be heard for miles. Dozens of men still on it plunged into the water, their screams cut short as they sank. The bridge that had been England's path to conquest became their grave. When the dust settled and the water calmed, the battlefield was a vision from hell. The north bank was carpeted with English dead. Bodies piled 3 and 4 deep in places. Horses lay where they had fallen, their magnificent forms twisted in death. Armor glinted in the afternoon sun, crushed and dented and covered in gore. Weapons lay everywhere, swords, spears, axes, all the tools of war abandoned by men who had learned too late that they had been led into a trap. Wallace and Moray, stood among their victorious but exhausted men. The Scots had won impossible victory, but it had cost them dearly as many brave men lay dead or dying. Among the wounded was Andrew Moray himself. Struck in battle, his wound would fester and kill him within weeks. His death would be an incalculable loss to Scotland, for Moray had been the strategic genius, the organizer, the nobleman whose name gave legitimacy to the rebellion. Without him, the burden of leadership would fall entirely on Wallace's shoulders. But in that moment of victory, as church bells began to ring across Scotland carrying news of the triumph, the Scots allowed themselves to celebrate. They had faced the might of England and destroyed it. They had proven that English knights were not invincible. They had shown that tactics and terrain and courage could overcome superior numbers and equipment. The Battle of Stirling Bridge had transformed Scotland's fight from scattered resistance into a coordinated rebellion, from hopeless defiance into genuine revolution. News of the defeat sent shockwaves through Britain and beyond. In England, the reaction was one of stunned disbelief. How could this have happened? How could the finest army in Europe, led by experienced commanders, have been destroyed by a rabble of Scottish peasants? The Earl of Surrey's reputation was ruined. He barely escaped Scotland with his life, fleeing south with the remnants of his army. Hugh Cressingham, who had pushed so hard for the battle, was dead, his name now synonymous with arrogant stupidity. King Edward I, campaigning in France when he received the news, was reportedly apoplectic with rage. His conquest of Scotland, which he had believed complete, was unraveling. The Scots who had sworn allegiance to him were breaking their oaths. The garrisons he had left to control Scotland were under siege or had already fallen. And a man named William Wallace, a commoner, an outlaw, a nobody, had destroyed an English army and was being hailed as the guardian of Scotland. Across Scotland, the reaction was very different. In cities and villages, in glens and on hilltops, the news spread like wildfire. Church bells rang in celebration. Bonfires were lit on the heights, signaling victory from one end of Scotland to the other. Men who had hidden from English patrols now emerged into the open. Nobles who had bent the knee to Edward began to reconsider their positions. The balance of power had shifted in a single day. Wallace's fame, already growing before Stirling, now exploded across Scotland and beyond. Before the battle, he had been known mostly to the common people, a guerrilla leader, a symbol of resistance. After Stirling Bridge, his name thundered across Europe. Chronicles written in monasteries from Scotland to Italy recorded the astonishing victory. Troubadours sang songs of the battle. Common people told stories of Wallace's heroism, each retelling adding new layers of legend to the man. He became more than a military commander. He became the living embodiment of Scottish resistance, the proof that freedom was possible, that England could be defeated, that Scotland's independence was worth fighting. The victory shattered the psychological grip England had held over Scotland since Dunbar. For more than a year, the Scots had lived under the shadow of English invincibility. They had watched their nobles surrender, their castles fall, their kingdom dissolve. They had been told, explicitly and implicitly, that resistance was futile, that English power was overwhelming, that their best hope was to submit gracefully and hope for mercy. Stirling Bridge destroyed that narrative completely. The English could be beaten. Their knights could die. Their armies could be destroyed. And it didn't require noble birth or formal training or vast resources. It required courage, intelligence, and the willingness to fight for freedom. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, Wallace moved with remarkable speed and strategic vision. He understood that victory in one battle, however spectacular, did not win wars. He needed to consolidate power, to transform momentum into lasting change. English garrisons throughout Scotland, already nervous and isolated, now faced a terrible dilemma. Many had been undermanned even before Stirling, relying on the deterrent effect of English military power rather than actual numbers. Now that deterrent was gone, garrison commanders looked at their small bands of soldiers, looked at the increasingly hostile Scottish population surrounding them, and made pragmatic decisions. Castles were quietly abandoned. Strongholds were surrendered without a fight. English officials fled south to England, taking what they could carry and leaving the rest behind. Wallace's forces swept through southern and central Scotland like a cleansing fire. Towns that had been occupied for over a year suddenly found themselves free. Castles that had flown English banners now raised the Scottish saltire. Tax collectors who had grown rich bleeding Scotland disappeared, either fled to England or found dead in ditches. The apparatus of English occupation, which had seemed so permanent just weeks before, collapsed with astonishing speed. Without the military force to back it up, without the fear that had kept people compliant, the occupation simply evaporated. The Scottish nobility, many of whom had sworn allegiance to Edward after Dunbar, now faced an uncomfortable reckoning. They had bent the knee out of pragmatism, believing resistance was impossible. Now a commoner had proven them wrong. Some nobles, particularly the younger and more idealistic, openly joined Wallace. They brought with them trained soldiers, equipment, legitimacy. Others offered more cautious support, hedging their bets, waiting to see if Wallace's success could be sustained. A few remained loyal to Edward, either out of genuine conviction or because they had been granted lands and titles as rewards for their submission. But even these loyalists found themselves isolated, their positions increasingly untenable as Scottish sentiment turned decisively against English rule. Wallace, despite his common birth, was thrust into a position of almost unprecedented authority. In any normal medieval society, noble birth was essential for political legitimacy. Kings ruled because of their bloodlines. Lords commanded because of their inherited titles. The entire feudal system depended on the principle that some men were born to lead and others to follow. Wallace had none of these advantages. His family was minor gentry at best. He had no great title, no inherited lands, no ancestral claim to leadership. What he had was victory. And in the desperate circumstances of 1297 Scotland, victory was enough. By late autumn of that year, Wallace had been formally declared Guardian of Scotland. The title itself was significant. He was not claiming to be king. Scotland already had a king, John Balliol. Though Balliol was in captivity in France, a broken man who had been humiliated by Edward and would never return to rule. Wallace claimed to rule in Balliol's name, preserving the fiction of legitimate royal authority while exercising real power himself. His seal, preserved in historical records, bore the words William, by the grace of God, guardian of the kingdom of Scotland and leader of its armies. It was an extraordinary title for an extraordinary man in extraordinary times. But Wallace understood that defensive victories, however spectacular, were not enough. He needed to demonstrate that Scotland could not just defend itself, but could strike back, could carry the war into England itself. In the autumn and winter of 1297, he led a series of devastating raids into northern England. His forces swept through Northumberland and Cumberland like scourge. English chroniclers, horrified and outraged, described the carnage in lurid detail. Villages burned, garrisons overwhelmed. English peasants experiencing the same terror and devastation that Scots had endured under occupation. These raids served multiple strategic purposes. They weakened English morale, proving that even in their own lands, the English were not safe from Scottish retaliation. They provided plunder and supplies desperately needed by the Scottish army, grain, livestock, weapons, anything that could sustain the rebellion. They forced Edward to divert resources to defending northern England rather than conquering Scotland. And perhaps most importantly, they sent a message: Scotland was no longer prey. Scotland could be predator. The psychological impact of this reversal cannot be overstated. Yet even in his moment of greatest triumph, Wallace faced challenges that victory alone could not solve. The death of Andrew Moray in late 1297 was a devastating blow. Moray had brought strategic brilliance, organizational skill, and noble legitimacy to the rebellion. His death meant that Wallace now stood alone at the head of Scotland's fight for freedom. For a man without noble birth, without formal education, without the network of family alliances that typically undergirded medieval political power, this was a precarious position indeed. The Scottish nobility, even those who supported the rebellion, were uncomfortable with Wallace's elevation. They respected his military genius, they celebrated his victories, but they bristled at taking orders from a commoner. Medieval society was rigidly hierarchical, and Wallace's rise violated every norm of that hierarchy. Some nobles questioned his authority. Others cooperated reluctantly, offering minimal support. A few actively worked against him, their pride wounded by having to follow a man they considered their social inferior. Wallace would spend much of his time as guardian trying to navigate these treacherous political waters, trying to hold together a fragile coalition united by hatred of English occupation, but divided by class resentment and personal ambition. Wallace also understood that Stirling Bridge, for all its brilliance, had not ended the war. It had merely changed its terms. Edward I was one of the most formidable military minds of the medieval period, a king who had conquered Wales through a combination of military force and strategic castle building, who had crushed rebellions before, who would not accept the loss of Scotland without a fight. Wallace knew that Edward would return with overwhelming force, that the English would learn from their mistakes at Stirling, that the next battle would be far more difficult. And so Wallace spent the winter and spring of 1298 preparing for the inevitable English invasion. He trained his spearmen, improved the discipline of his schiltrons, gathered supplies, fortified positions. He knew he had won a battle through superior tactics and terrain. He knew that in the coming fight, he would need to find new advantages because Edward would not make the same mistakes as Surrey in Cressingham. The Guardian of Scotland understood that his greatest victory might also be his last if he could not adapt, could not find new ways to counter English power. The legacy of Stirling Bridge extended far beyond the immediate military and political consequences. The battle became a defining moment in Scottish national identity, a story told and retold across generations. It demonstrated that a people united in defense of their freedom could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. It showed that tactical brilliance could defeat superior numbers and equipment. It proved that leaders could emerge from anywhere, that nobility of spirit mattered more than nobility of birth. For William Wallace himself, Stirling Bridge was both triumph and tragedy. It made him a national hero, the greatest champion Scotland had known in living memory. It also made him a marked man. Edward I would spend years hunting him, offering massive rewards for his capture, making him the most wanted man in Britain. Wallace's later defeat at Falkirk in 1298, his years as an outlaw again, his eventual capture and horrific execution in 1305, all of this would come later. But Stirling Bridge remained his masterpiece, the moment when a guerrilla leader became a guardian, when Scotland stopped running and started fighting. The battle also revealed fundamental truths about medieval warfare that would influence military thinking for generations. It showed that cavalry, for all its power and prestige, had critical vulnerabilities. That terrain could be a weapon as deadly as any sword. That mobility and tactical positioning mattered more than sheer numbers. That underestimating an enemy because of their social class or lack of formal training was a recipe for disaster. Military commanders studying the battle in later centuries would recognize in Wallace's tactics echoes of principles that remained relevant. Know your ground, choose your battlefield, force the enemy to fight on your terms, never underestimate a desperate and determined foe. For the common people of Scotland, Stirling Bridge became a story of hope that transcended its immediate historical context. In an age when nobles and kings seemed to hold all the power, when ordinary people were expected to simply endure whatever their betters decided for them, Wallace showed that common men could change history. The spearmen who stood in those schiltrons, the farmers and craftsmen who had set aside their ordinary lives to fight for freedom, had destroyed the finest knights England could field. That fact, that reversal of the expected order, resonated deeply in Scottish memory. As the sun set on September 11th, 1297, as the last of the English survivors fled south and the Scots began the grim work of clearing the battlefield, no one could have known exactly how history would judge what had happened that day. They could not have known that 7 centuries later, people would still tell the story of the Battle of Stirling Bridge. They could not have known that William Wallace would become one of history's great symbols of resistance against oppression, that his name would be invoked by freedom fighters around the world, that his story would inspire films and books and songs. What they did know, standing there among the dead on the banks of the River Forth, was that they had won. Against all odds, against all expectations, against the most powerful army in Europe, they had won. They had proven that Scotland's freedom was worth fighting for, and that Scotsmen could fight for it successfully. They had sent a message that would echo through the centuries, that no occupation is permanent, that no conquest is complete, that the human spirit's desire for freedom can overcome any obstacle. The wooden bridge that had been the fulcrum of the battle would eventually be rebuilt, would be replaced over the centuries by stronger structures, until today a modern bridge crosses the Forth near where Wallace and Moray sprung their trap. But the memory of what happened there remains. The Battle of Stirling Bridge stands as a testament to courage, to tactical genius, to the power of fighting for something you believe in more than life itself. William Wallace would fight on for years after Stirling, would suffer defeats as well as victories, would ultimately be betrayed and captured and executed with horrific cruelty by the English. But nothing that came after could diminish what he accomplished on that September day. He took an occupied country and gave it hope. He took a defeated people and gave them pride. He took a narrow wooden bridge and turned it into England's nightmare and Scotland's salvation. In the end, the Battle of Stirling Bridge reminds us that history is not inevitable, that the powerful are not invincible, that sometimes the impossible happens because ordinary people decide it must. On the banks of the River Forth, in the marshy ground where English knights fell to Scottish spears, Scotland learned a lesson it would never forget, that freedom is worth any price, and that those who fight for it with courage and intelligence can achieve miracles. The legacy of September 11th, 1297, lives on not just in Scottish history, but in the universal human story of resistance against oppression. Wherever people fight for their freedom against overwhelming odds, wherever guerrilla forces use terrain and tactics to overcome superior enemies, wherever common people rise up against those who would subjugate them, the spirit of Stirling Bridge endures. William Wallace and Andrew Moray gave Scotland more than a military victory. They gave their country proof that independence was possible, that England could be beaten, that Scotland's story was not over, but just beginning. And that wooden bridge, groaning under the weight of English knights riding to what they thought would be easy victory, became instead the foundation of Scottish national identity. The place where Scotland said no, where Scotland fought back, where Scotland won. The Battle of Stirling Bridge was not just a military engagement. It was the moment when Scotland reclaimed its soul.